you willing to put aside all speculation and announce to the people here that you are not running in 2020? No.
Overall, wages are down. People are working longer hours for less money. Obama, these aren't illegal immigrants.
African Americans being mistreated in society.
Noting that world leaders laughed at President Trump. Thanks to the president's trade war.
You know what it is? Our new slogan, 2020. Keep America great.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of 2020 Vision. We've got plenty to get through this week, and that's in no small part because of the weekend submission of the Mueller Report. We couldn't have asked for a better guest to talk us through that, as well as some of the 2020 Democrats dominating the headlines this week, and spend a bit of time discussing classic Hollywood cinema and its impact on presidential politics. Before I introduce our guest, let's hear some of the reaction to the Mueller Report and Attorney-General William Barr's summary of its conclusions.
The Attorney General's comments make it clear that Congress must step in to get the truth and provide full transparency to the American people. We will ask the Attorney General to testify before the House Judiciary Committee. We will demand the release of the full report.
That report needs to be made public.
Yes.
The American people have a right and a need to know.
To see the Mueller report, not the Barr report.
After a long investigation, after so many people have been so badly hurt, after not looking at the other side, it was just announced there was no collusion with Russia, the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. There was no collusion with Russia. It was a complete and total exoneration.
Stephen Loosley was an Australian Labor senator during the Hawke and Keating governments, where he chaired both the Joint Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade and the Senate Regulations Committee. He is also a former ALP national president. He's currently a non-resident senior fellow at the United States Study Centre and a columnist for the Australian newspaper. Stephen, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
It's a pleasure, Drew. Glad to be with you.
I realise we've only had a few hours here in Australia to digest some of the summary of Robert Mueller's report from the US Attorney General. What's your initial reaction to the release of some of these findings?
It will change the dynamic in American politics. The waiting on Mueller scenario is now disappeared. The Attorney General has made it clear the special counsel has determined no collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians, the Putin administration for 2016. And he's gone a little further. The AG has said insufficient evidence for a charge of obstruction of justice. So essentially what Attorney General Barr has done has drawn a line across the page. Now, this means the Democrats can still pursue matters in the different House inquiries, particularly Adam Schiff and the House Intelligence Committee. They'll be focused on obstruction of justice and what Mueller may or may not have missed. But the impeachment caravan probably has lost a couple of wheels here, which is healthy in American politics in this sense. It really means that the parties and the candidates will have to focus more on policy for 2020 and alternative political profiles rather than it simply be an anti-Trump crusade with impeachment as its end.
Okay, so let's talk about Democrats. So you wrote a column for the Australian newspaper recently about the considerable length of time it's been since the Democrats came close to dominating politics in a state like Texas. You suggested that might change if Beto O'Rourke ran for the Democratic nomination. Now, he's since declared his candidacy. Do you think we might have another Lyndon Johnson on our hands here?
There will never, ever be another Lyndon Johnson.
Yes, fair enough.
Extraordinary figure, a figure of legend as Senator, Majority Leader, and as President. Quite remarkable, as Robert Caro has spent the last couple of decades documenting in his, I think it's now 4-volume biography, and we're awaiting the final volume. Beto O'Rourke is an interesting character, and that's why he caught my attention. Friends of mine in Texas, Democrats, talk about him being the best retail politician since Jack Kennedy in terms of the way he relates to people out on the stump. And, of course, when he ran against Ted Cruz, the incumbent Republican senator, he campaigned in a pickup truck, a dusty pickup truck in every county in Texas.
Right.
That's a massive effort.
Yeah.
And it was his appeal to grassroots voters and grassroots supporters that meant he raised some $80 million without any political action committee money. And he fell short against Cruz, there's no question about that. But he was so successful in terms of building momentum that a lot of Democrats were elected in different parts of Texas, particularly around Houston and Dallas. And it's pointed out to me that if you look at the undeniable electoral college framework, in 2020 the probability is the Democrats carry New York State and the Northeast, plus Illinois, and in all likelihood California and the West Coast. So there's a solid basis of support. Where Hillary Clinton's campaign stumbled very badly, of course, was in the Midwest and the upper Midwest, which was surprising for a lot of people, myself included. Now, if O'Rourke did better in Texas in a presidential poll, and he would because the turnout would be higher amongst traditional core constituencies for the Democratic Party. We're thinking of young people, especially students, Latinos, and African Americans. They tend to turn out in greater numbers. Then it's possible carrying Texas delivers the presidency, the White House, to the Democratic Party. Now, they haven't carried Texas. Democrats have not carried Texas in a long, long time. Bill Clinton went close in 92 but did not get there. So that the Texas Democratic Party, which produced Lyndon Johnson and the great speaker Sam Rayburn and others, has really been in the shade for some time. Now, O'Rourke may shift that reality. He's certainly going to be worth watching in the primaries coming up. Primaries out in Iowa and up in New Hampshire and in South Carolina will suit him. If he's a retail politician, the way my friends describe him, those times and those electorates will suit him.
One name that has suddenly been thrown into the mix of real contenders is Pete Buttigieg from Indiana, or Mayor Pete, as he's called. He's had some impressive political donation numbers himself following a fine performance in a CNN town hall. Any thoughts on why he's been able to cut through at this stage? Because he's so personable. I've actually had the pleasure of meeting him. I met him at the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue in July last year, sat with him and talked with him. Okay. He's a very warm and obviously genuine person, and he's got a concern for his constituents, South Bend, Indiana and beyond. He's got a natural appeal. And it's been a while since a small-town mayor figured on the national stage. Yeah. But he is the type of candidate who communicates very effectively, who obviously committed to trying to better his fellow citizens' circumstances, and again is not beholden to any special interests. And I think that's the appeal that we're going to find. It's going to be very interesting when Vice President Biden declares his hand, and assuming he runs, what the reaction will be when the Democratic establishment falls in large measure behind the former Vice President. Yep. It's going to be an interesting internal contest. The United States has a new ambassador to Australia who touched down earlier this month. You mentioned in some of your commentary about Arthur Culverhouse's arrival that the ambassadorial role was more important than ever during the Trump presidency. Can you elaborate on what you meant by that? Because in Washington, D.C., and I must say in Washington, D.C. earlier this year, I met Ambassador Culverhouse. He's a very genial figure. He's widely liked and widely well respected, which is why he was confirmed unanimously by the United States Senate. So we're fortunate, having missed out on Harry Harris being sent off to Seoul, to have someone of his stature as ambassador here. What I was referring to is simply this. There are different dimensions in American foreign policy that are evident in Washington, D.C. at the moment. There's the presidential tweet, the off-the-cuff remark, which is aimed overwhelmingly at President Trump's base constituency. So bang, there's a tweet. Then the vice president normally comes out and makes a speech defining American policy in far more coherent terms. So that's the administration. You have to watch both.
beyond in terms of the Pentagon, state and the other great agencies, there is a different dimension there too, which we see in the person best probably of Secretary Pompeo.
Right.
Then there's the Congress. And we see that in Venezuela at the moment, for example, the American policy on Venezuela, with Senator Marco Rubio from Florida having taken a leading role. And while there's no replacement for Senator John McCain in terms of gravitas, Senator Lindsey Graham and others do make their presence felt. So you have these different dimensions. Now, for Australia, we're reasonably well placed pretty much across the board and beyond with the American electorate. But it's necessary for an ambassador who represents the president, of course, not the Congress or the bureaucracy, but the president. It's necessary for the ambassador in Canberra to be able to do this. And I go back to Prime Minister Menzies' original conversation with President Lyndon Johnson, who sent Ed Clark to Australia, his Texas confidant to Australia. Now, a lot of Australians dismissed Ed Clark as being a yokel, a good-natured, humorous yokel. He was not. He had been LBJ's campaign fundraiser for a long time, and there were a few people closer to Lyndon Johnson. So what Prime Minister Menzies said to the President, and from what we gathered, the President's approval, there was only one qualification for the American ambassador to Australia, and that was to be able to pick up the phone and talk directly to the President of the United States. Yep. And over the years, we've seen ambassadors who could do that. I mean, Mel Semler, for example, with George H.W. Bush, Jeff Blosh with Barack Obama, and there are others, but they're good examples of it. And I think in Ambassador Culverhouse, we probably have a person of that capacity.
You mentioned Senator John McCain just before. He has, for some reason, drawn the ire of President Trump in the past fortnight, despite it being several months, of course, since his death. I'll get some thoughts from you in a minute, Stephen, but let's first hear what he's had to say.
Trump has persisted despite blowback from Republicans on Capitol Hill, outrage from McCain's family. The president just won't let this go.
Hammered the late senator and war hero in front of a pro-military crowd in Ohio.
McCain didn't get the job done for our great vets and the VA, and they knew it.
The crowd listened in silence as Trump told them he never got a thank you for authorizing the use of an Air Force jet to transfer McCain's casket for his memorial service.
I gave him the kind of funeral that he wanted, which as president I had to approve. I don't care about this. I didn't get thank you. That's okay. We sent him on the way, but I wasn't a fan of John McCain. Not my kind of guy.
Senator John McCain is dead. Why are you doing this?
So it's not a good portion of my time. It's a very small portion. But if you realize about 3 days ago it came out that his main person gave to the FBI the fake news dossier. It was a fake. It was a fraud. It was paid for by Hillary Clinton and the Democrats. They gave it to John McCain, who gave it to the FBI for very evil purposes. That's not good. And the other thing, he voted against repeal and replace. Now, he's been campaigning for years for repeal and replace. I'm not a fan.
Stephen, do you have any theories as to why such a prominent and greatly admired Republican figure continues to be a subject of such an obsession by the president?
Precisely because of what you just said,
right,
Drew. Precisely for that reason. There can only be one great Republican in the American political universe at the moment in the presidential mind, and that's Donald Trump.
Okay.
And he resented the fact that Senator McCain had a peripheral role in the Steele report ending up with the FBI. This was, of course, the dossier that documented alleged links to the Russians prior to 2016. So what Donald Trump is doing is trying to demolish McCain's reputation and thereby enhance his own.
Right.
And that's what it's about.
Senator McCain was considered a great friend of Australia and often used his chairmanship of the Senate Armed Services Committee to help nurture that relationship. Are you concerned about the lack of advocates of the US-Australia relationship in Congress after his departure and that of many other key committee personnel following the 2018 midterms?
No, not unduly, for this reason that when there was something of a row over the telephone conversation between Prime Minister Turnbull and President Trump over a deal struck on asylum seekers with the previous Obama administration, there are a lot of people in the Congress rallied around Australia, and people who are good friends of Australia, like Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee. That constituency is still there.
Right.
Now, it may not have the gravitas of John McCain, but there are a number of very influential congressmen and senators who are very good friends of Australia. And, of course, the Congressional Caucus that is friends with Australia demonstrates that too, as does Ambassador Hockey's mateship campaign.
Yeah.
I think that's been very useful. So I think we're reasonably well placed with the Congress. No one's going to replace John McCain.
Yep. He's
like Lyndon Johnson. I mean, this is a figure of legend. And we're not going to see his alike again. But there'll be other men and women who step up in both houses. And I think we're reasonably well placed.
You yourself served for many years in two Labor federal governments. If the ALP are successful in the federal election come May, do you believe we'd see a drastic departure from the kind of interaction Australia has had with the US administration until this point?
No, I don't think so. The relationship overwhelmingly is bipartisan. And everything that Senator Wong in the foreign affairs arena and Richard Miles in the defence area have had to say underlines that. I think we will work the relationship hard in those different constituencies. I think we'll be closer to the Americans in the South Pacific than we've been. There are a number of projects underway. And I think in terms of the American relationship, provided the US and China can work out the trade dispute, we can focus on what's really important, and that's been important to both countries really since Harry Truman.
One of your signature areas of expertise, and some people may not know this, but it's classic Hollywood cinema. What about these films and that era is a cause of such fascination for you?
Because it's instrumental in showing how people see themselves. For example, let's take a Chinese example.
Yep.
I'm thinking of Wolf Warrior 2.
Yes.
A marvellous Rambo with Chinese characteristics, but it's how China sees itself. It's the highest grossing film in the history of the Chinese cinema, nearly $1 billion American from memory. A former Chinese Special Forces officer who's disgraced, living in exile in Africa, becomes embroiled in a civil war in which the villains are Americans and Europeans, mercenaries. The US consulate is closed. The US Navy has departed.
Yep.
But the Chinese Navy's off the coast. However, it will not intervene. The Chinese military will not intervene without a UN Security Council mandate. And really, that's how China sees itself. And of course, there's a sensitivity there about Africa and the Middle East because during the Arab Spring, China was obliged to ask Western navies to evacuate their nationals. They took a deliberate decision in Beijing thereafter that they'd have the capacity to evacuate their nationals from most parts of the world in the future. Hence, the film illustrates that. So I think it's certainly true of American movies of the classic period. It's like American presidential libraries, Joe. I mean, if you go out to the Truman Library at Independence, Missouri, that's the United States in 1950. It's quite remarkable. To the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Memorial and home, Dutchess County, New York, the United States during the Second World War, and so it runs. And some of them, I'm thinking of the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California, has actually captured the personality of the president. Right. There's a lot of good humour in it, and it's the same with film.
In May, you're hosting a screening with the United States Study Centre of the 1962 version of the Manchurian Candidate. In that adaptation, the villain attempting to brainwash Raymond Shaw and influence American presidential politics was the communist governments of China and the Soviet Union. In the 2004 version, it was updated to big corporations trying to get a sleeper agent in the White House. I was wondering if the film was remade today in 2019, who do you think might be the villain now?
I suspect it would probably be the earlier version because the film is based on the Korean War experiences of American POWs, and other Allied POWs suffered the same way at the hands of the North Koreans, and some, of course, disappeared into the Soviet Union, never to be seen again. So I suspect that the filmmakers would focus on North Korea, perhaps with some assistance from the Russians, perhaps from the Chinese.
Yep.
That is a quite remarkable film. The performances of the main players, including Frank Sinatra, absolutely stand out. And the film was taken out of circulation after the Kennedy assassination.
Oh, really?
Because of its finale. But Angela Lansbury, Lawrence Harvey, Sinatra, and others. I mean, it's an extraordinary film. I don't think the later version works as well.
Right.
So if you ask me, what would the updated movie look like? I think it'd be a lot closer to the earlier rather than the later version.
Mm-hmm. What's Hollywood's role in US politics today, do you think? Are they a player at all, or is that's kind of influence being acquiesced, I guess, to mediums like the news media?
I think Hollywood has a powerful role, and sometimes that can be very positive. For example, at the Study Centre a couple of months back, we screened All the President's Men.
Yes.
Which is a film that has aged remarkably well. The performances are really top draw. I'm thinking Jason Robards as Ben Bradley and Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman as Woodward and Bernstein. But the challenges for American media, indeed for media generally, are even greater now than they were during the Nixon years. And it's how people respond to those pressures and how they actually endeavour to build a narrative that's based on truth, on the facts of what actually happened. You take a movie like Vice, for example, which is something of a comedy and a biopic of Dick Cheney. There are definitely lessons in that either way. From Cheney's earliest time, learning how hard life is out in Casper, Wyoming, to the final moments of the film where he speaks directly to the audience. The same with a movie like The Front Runner, about Gary Hart's doomed campaign. So Hollywood is very valuable in terms of charting the course of American politics, the mix with business, with voters, with media, and so on, the issues that come and go. And the great movies survive and continue to influence events. I mean, from memory, All the President's Men was made in 1976, and here it is 40-odd years later, and it still stands analysis.
I wondered finally if I could ask you to pick any film that would perfectly, I guess, sort of epitomise the current state of US politics or the Trump era or the state of US political discourse at the moment. What would that be?
Unquestionably, in my mind, Drew, it would be Robert Rosson's 1949 film All the King's Men.
Right.
It's based on Robert Penn Warren's novel, a great novel, about Governor Willie Stark, governor of Louisiana, who is unquestionably modelled on Governor Huey Long. And it's raw-edged politics, the importance of the base, the importance of family, the importance of taking on your opponents, whether they be in your own party or beyond, in order to win and not blinking. Broderick Crawford gives an extraordinary performance. There's a later version of the film which I don't think will age as well as this one.
Right.
But in terms of the roughhouse of politics and the mobilisation of the base in particular, I think it's illustrative of American politics then and now.
Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your insights.
An absolute pleasure, Drew.
Thanks this week to Kevin MacLeod, the Marion Circle Drum Brigade, Ketzer and the Bubba Brass Band for their musical contributions, and to the University of Sydney's Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences for their studio assistance.